Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our presentation today. I want to welcome those here in the room as well as those that are with us virtually online. And of course, to our guest today, Brian Mora. I'd also like to extend a very heartfelt thank you to all of our veterans for their service to our great nation. We're on the eve of Veterans Day, and it's never too early to thank them. Thank you for being here today. My name is Jason Brzezinski. I'm a senior principal within MITRE's National Security Engineering Center. Today's event is part of the Center for Strategic Competitions speaker series, and it is co-hosted by MITRE's National Security Sector. This activity is now in its fourth year, and this series focuses on topics that are related to strategic competition ranging from national security to economic statecraft, to supply chain demographics, and many other topics as well. Today, it gives me extraordinarily great pleasure to introduce my dear friend and former colleague, Brian Mora. And today, Brian is going to talk with us about the 1983 Able Archer exercise and the war scare that resulted from that activity. This activity concerned an annual NATO military exercise that nearly triggered nuclear war with the Soviet Union in 1983. And today we'll explore some lessons learned for nuclear and conventional deterrence today in the modern age. I think with that, I will turn it over to Brian to share what I think is both a riveting and terrifying story. He's able to account this in tremendous detail from his personal experience as well as from his book, The Able Archers, which is available here at the table for those interested. Brian.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jason. Can everybody hear me? Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here at MITRE. And thanks again to the whole MITRE team who have set this up. From Able Archer to artificial intelligence, it's a big topic. So I'll try to get through this today as expeditiously as we can to leave some time for questions. Today is November 8th, and the significance of that to the Able Archer nuclear war scare is significant because many observers think that November 8th, 1983, was the height of the Able Archer crisis. It's a period of time that Mikhail Gorbachev later called the most dangerous time in human history. So we're going to explore why he would have said that. So this is me. I'm a former Air Force intelligence officer. I also had a lengthy career as a senior executive in the aerospace and defense business, where I did work on a lot of intelligence programs and other defense programs. Since I retired, I've been writing a series of books, beginning with The Able Archers, which was published in 2022. So that came out just a couple of years ago. And I'll talk a little bit about those books as we go through. But the main focus today is going to be on the actual history of the 1983 crisis and what it might mean for today. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, Operation Able Archer 83 was, as Jason said, the nuclear phase of an integrated, interlocking set of exercises that NATO conducted during the fall of 1983. And again, 8 November, many people believe was probably the height of the danger period. From Able Archer to the age of AI, there was artificial intelligence in 1983. And there was a very popular movie that year called War Games, which some of you probably remember, which was about a supercomputer infused with artificial intelligence that runs amok, I guess one could say, and nearly executes a nuclear first strike from the United States against the Soviet Union. We've come a long way, baby, in terms of AI since then. But one of the more interesting quotes, I think, from that film is from this mythical General Behringer, who says, "After very careful consideration, sir, I have come to the conclusion that your new defense system sucks because it nearly caused a nuclear war. Today, General Anthony Cotton, who's STRATCOM commander, is a big believer in AI, and he's spoken out about this quite a bit just this year. And one of the quotes that I think is germane is in regard to nuclear command and control, is his statement that AI will enhance our decision-making capabilities. So this is my background. I've gone through most of this already. I'll point to the bottom of the page, and if you're interested in the Cold War, if you're interested in nuclear deterrence, I would urge you to watch the Netflix series that came out earlier this year, Turning Point, The Bomb in the Cold War. I think it's 9 episodes, and episode number 5 is called War Games, and it's largely about the 1983 nuclear war crisis. And I do appear in that one, in that episode. They also filmed me talking about the Soviet war in Afghanistan, although they didn't use that footage and they didn't really talk much about the Soviet war in Afghanistan, which is the topic of my second book, The Righteous Arrows, which I think is a shame because I think that war is very, very important in many ways to understanding the world today. So speaking of the 2 books, this is my unpaid advertisement for the books. Again, The Able Archers came out in 22. The Righteous Arrows was released in 2024. And they're stories about these Cold War events as told through the eyes of 2 different intelligence officers, one American and one Soviet, based on real events that, again, I think continue to inform and shape our world today. And I wrote them as dramatizations, as historical fiction, because I wanted to reach a wider audience than a straight nonfiction treatment might receive. So they're written like fast-paced thrillers because the events themselves are fast-paced and pretty thrilling. So it lends itself to that kind of a treatment. You all know this guy, Bob Gates, wrote a very nice blurb for The Able Archers, and I pulled out part of it because it does explain in part what I was trying to get at, I think, with the Able Archers book. And Bob said, occasionally a work of fiction is best suited to bring little known but dangerous historical events to life. The Able Archers is also a powerful reminder of the value of human judgment and the continuing peril posed by nuclear armed powers. So the 1983 crisis is, as Secretary Gates says here, little known. And let's talk about that for a minute. Why is it relatively unknown, particularly in comparison to the Cuban Missile Crisis? There are a lot of reasons. I can only fit a few on the slide, but here are some of the ones that I think are among the more important ones. For starters, the Cuban Missile Crisis played out very publicly. President Kennedy made a couple of national addresses during the crisis. They revealed classified imagery both on U.S. television and later when Adlai Stevenson gave a very public presentation at the United Nations Security Council. There was frequent communication, both overt and covert, between the United States and the Soviet Union, some of which was reported on during the crisis itself. And then after the crisis, because it turned out fortuitously, the world didn't blow up, a lot of people wanted to take credit for it. So there are lots of memoirs and a lot of public records have been made available. And as many of you know, lots of movies, books, and even television shows about the Cuban Missile Crisis. By contrast, the 1983 nuclear war scare, most of the details remain highly classified by the United States until about 10 years ago. It also was a crisis that played out over months, not days, and it really requires one to kind of connect the dots to understand what was going on. And it is, I think, a little bit more difficult to get your arms around than the Cuban Missile Crisis in that respect. Also, in 83 and 84, there were disagreements within the U.S. intelligence community about the significance of these events. And the Russians never released their records on what they were thinking during this crisis. We know from Gorbachev's public statements some of what was being discussed in the Politburo, but importantly, just in recent years, Ukraine has released some of the archival information that they had because they were part of the Soviet Union at the time, and that has enhanced our understanding of, at least to some degree, of what the Russians were thinking. So I mentioned, to really understand this crisis, you have to connect a bunch of dots. And on this cartoon, what I've shown are some of the more important events that led up to this crisis period in the fall of 1983. In March of 83, President Reagan, and Ronald Reagan was president in 1983, he gave a couple of very provocative speeches that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. In April of that year, there were airspace violations in the Pacific. The more serious of those was the US violation of Soviet airspace, which the Soviets kind of retaliated for a couple of days later. Because of that US Navy violation of Soviet sovereign airspace, the Soviet air defense network in the Far East went to an unprecedented level of alert during the spring and summer. That led, I would argue, to the conditions that led to the shoot down of the Korean airliner on the 1st of September 1983. And again, we're going to talk in a bit more detail about this. The Kremlin warnings that I'm referring to here in the summer of 83, visitors who went to the Kremlin to see Yuri Andropov, who was the general secretary of the Communist Party at that time, reported when they came back that, wow, Andropov is really paranoid. All he talked about was US and NATO provocations, preparations for a nuclear first strike. He's really, really worried about what the state of the world, basically. We're going to talk about these events too, culminating in Able Archer 83 and a global Soviet nuclear alert. So who are these antagonists in 1983? Ronald Reagan, of course, and his opposite number, Yuri Andropov, on the left. Just to kind of provide context, the era of détente by 1983 was really over, and tensions had been rising for several years, but certainly especially since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which took place in December of 1979. The leaders, unlike in 1962 when Khrushchev and Kennedy were communicating, these two gentlemen were not communicating, and there was not a lot of communication going on between the State Department and the Soviet Foreign Ministry either. Yuri Andropov, his background is that he became the Soviet leader in November of 1982 when Leonid Brezhnev died. He had been KGB chairman for many years, 16 or 17 years prior to that. As KGB chairman, in the spring of 1981, he launched a program known as Operation Rion. And Rion is a Russian acronym that stands for nuclear rocket attack. This was the largest intelligence collection program the Soviets had since World War II. Initially, it involved just the KGB, but it extended to the GRU as well. And it was a global intelligence collection effort to find US and NATO preparations for a nuclear first strike. So in effect, it started with a conclusion. There's going to be a US and NATO nuclear first strike. We just don't know when and under what circumstances. So Rion is designed to help us nail down when it might happen and under what circumstances it might happen. Ronald Reagan, I mentioned he gave two provocative speeches in the spring of 1983, both in March of 83. The first one was on the 8th of March, and it became known as his Evil Empire speech. And this is the speech in which he called the Soviet Union the focus of evil in the modern world. This did not go over real well in the Kremlin. They found it highly insulting, not just to the Communist Party, but to the Russian people. Just a couple of weeks later, in a nationally televised address, primetime address, for those of us who remember those, Reagan gave a speech revealing the existence of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was an initiative, and I'm sure all of you know about it, to provide a missile defense for the United States and its allies. The press derisively dubbed it Star Wars. The press reported that this was an impossible task to actually do something like this, to create a nuclear shield, but it was perceived quite differently in the Kremlin. They believed that, well, the Americans can probably pull this off, and if they do, they could initiate a nuclear first strike, remember Operation Rion, and then they could sit back behind this nuclear defensive shield, and we couldn't retaliate successfully. So all of this meant that tensions in 1983 were really at a fever pitch. So on the 1st of September 1983, the Soviet Air Defense Forces shot down a Korean airliner, a Korean 747, that had originated at JFK, refueled in Anchorage, and was flying from Anchorage to Seoul when it went off course and was eventually shot down. So it is kind of, as I argued earlier, the natural culmination of the Soviet air defense alert that had been taking place since April of that year. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about the Korean Airlines shoot down, because it is really the trigger, as I say, for the tensions that culminated in Able Archer 83 that fall. So this was on the 1st of September. The dashed line is the planned route of flight for KL-007. The solid line is the actual route of flight. This is the crash area just off Sakhalin Island, where the plane went down after being shot down by a Soviet Su-15 fighter. So I've mentioned this air defense alert. The night of the 1st of September, a U.S. Air Force RC-135 was actually orbiting off the eastern coast of Petropavlovsk of Kamchatka because it was anticipating a test flight of a Soviet ICBM. That test flight never happened that night. The Cobra Ball RC-135 went back to its base. Unfortunately, the Korean airliner flew right through the Cobra Ball's orbit, confused the Soviets. This KL-007 was way off track where it was supposed to be. It was considerably farther north than it was supposed to be. And it overflew Petropavlovsk, Soviet nuclear subbase, really got the Soviets excited. It continued off course until it crossed Sakhalin Island, where it was eventually shot down by an Su-15, killing everybody on board. In my book, The Able Archers, my character, Captain Katani, is on duty that night. He's my alter ego. I was actually on duty that night when it happened in Tokyo, and was commanding the intelligence fusion center that kind of put together what happened. So in the aftermath of that, and something that is not known, and I was gratified that NSA actually let me put it in the Able Archers book. And I should point out that both of these books, The Able Archers and The Righteous Arrows, have gone through all the clearance processes with OSD and with the intel community. There was an event after the Korean Airlines shoot down that nearly was a shooting war between the United States Air Force and the Soviet Air Force. This gentleman, Chuck Donnelly, was the commander of U.S. Forces Japan during the KL-007 events. later a 4-star. And this quote is a direct quote from this confrontation that I'm going to talk about really briefly. The Soviets mischaracterized a Navy EP-3, and an EP-3, for those of you who don't know, is an intelligence collection platform. They mischaracterized it as a border violator, that it was violating Soviet airspace. It wasn't, but they thought it was, and they sent 2 MiG-23s up with target destruct orders to shoot it down. General Donnelly in our command post sent 4 F-15s to intercept the MiG-23s, which they did successfully, and they were about to shoot them down when Donnelly told them to stand down. He wanted to wait to see if the EP-3's evasive maneuvers would enable it to get away without a shooting incident. And fortunately, it did get away. The EP-3 was able to evade the MiG-23s, and it got home safely. But we came within literally seconds of having MiG-23s shot down by F-15s. Later that same afternoon, the Soviet Air Defense Network misidentified an NHK television plane as a border violator. They sent 2 MiG-23s up to shoot it down. The lead pilot in that MiG-23 flight said, "Hey, it's a TV plane. You know, I'm not shooting down a TV plane." And they told him, "You have your order, shoot it down." And he said, and we were collecting his comms, of course, and he said to his controller, "Oh, I'm bingo fuel, I'm returning to base." So that was, we got very, again, it was a close run thing. And Donnelly, I think, deserves a lot of credit for having cool judgment to diffuse the situation that could have escalated into a real shooting war, and Lord knows where that would have gone given the state of relations between the Soviet Union and the United States at that period of time. There was a lot of fallout politically from the KL-007 incident, and those of you who were around at that time will remember that there were lots of recriminations. The United States released classified information in the UN Security Council again, accusing the Soviet Union of intentional murder. The Soviets, for their part, maintained that this was an intelligence collection flight and it was a legitimate target, which they still believe today, by the way. That's still the official position in the Kremlin. Communications, which had already been frayed, really just broke down at that point. And the Kremlin believed that, well, this was another provocation. They've been provoking us with overflights, et cetera. And this is another provocation. It's another excuse for them to trigger a nuclear first strike. So deterrence was tested here, and fortunately it held, but it was, again, a very tense period of time. So just shortly after the KAL incident, NATO kicks off its annual Autumn Forge exercises, again, which are a series of interlocking exercises that take place from September into mid-November, beginning with a conventional war, well, pre-war phase, then a conventional war phase, then a chemical weapons phase, and then finally a nuclear war phase. And the nuclear war phase of the exercise is called Able Archer. And because it was in 1983, it was Able Archer 83. But just a few weeks after the KAL shoot down, there's another incident that I'll talk about here, and which I describe in my book, the Petrov incident. So what's the Petrov incident all about? The ICBM scare. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. And I'll point out there's an interesting documentary on Petrov called The Man Who Saved the World, which was co-produced by Kevin Costner. It came out 10 years ago or thereabouts. It's an interesting thing to take a look at. In any event, what was this all about? Well, remember Operation Rion's premise that NATO, US is planning a nuclear first strike. This particular night, that prophecy seems to come true. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was commanding the watch that evening at the Soviet's National Missile Defense Center. And he is an expert on the Soviets' relatively new missile warning satellites. They'd been on orbit about a year at this point, and his actual role at the National Missile Defense Center was not as a watch officer. He was the chief of algorithm development for signal processing of the data coming off of these satellites. So he's an expert on the pros and cons of these satellite systems. Petrov, the man who saved the world, he is on duty that night only because a colleague got ill. He's not a normal watchstander. Very fortuitous, I would say, just like having General Donnelly in command in Japan was fortuitous. Just a quick footnote to this story, we did not know about this in 1983, and that's an important point, actually, no, more than a footnote. And the West only became aware of the Petrov incident in about 1999 as a result of one of the general officers in Petrov's chain of command writing his memoir. Remember, the Soviet Union's kaput by the late 90s, of course. And this retired general officer wrote his memoirs. And in his memoir, there's a chapter called The Man Who Saved the World. And he goes into detail about the Petrov incident. Prior to that, no one in the West knew about it because the Soviets had kept it really highly classified. They put it into a SAP and so on. And you can imagine why they did that. But what happened that night is that Soviet satellites erroneously detect multiple waves of US ICBM launches. Petrov is the guy that has to make the decisions on the scene. He believes from the outset that these have to be false alarms. That they're not real launches. His confidence, his self-confidence in that assessment begins to erode as the minutes tick by, but he sticks to his guns. And one of the things he did that night that got him into a lot of trouble was he did not report in a timely fashion back to Moscow on the initial launches or the launch detections. When he finally does report, he does advise Moscow that he believes these are false alarms and there's no reason to retaliate. And remember, this is in the context of Operation Rion, and the Korean airliner's just been shot down, and it's a tense period of time. So deterrence, we didn't know of this incident. Had we known of this incident, would our confidence have been shaken in the Soviets' ability to command and control their nuclear forces? Maybe, but maybe not. And then, of course, the Soviets also had their own artificial intelligence capabilities, most famously, perhaps, Dead Hand. And I know Jason knows a lot about this. So would their command and control system have taken over and initiated a retaliatory strike for a phantom attack? We'll never know, thank goodness, because Petrov nipped it in the bud. So that brings us up to the final chapter in that fall, which is Able Archer 83, where Soviet paranoia really peaks. As I mentioned, it is the climax. It's the final phase of Autumn Forge. It's the nuclear phase. It's held in early November. Able Archer, the exercise this year, we don't have time to get into it right now, but there are some peculiar elements to the exercise that really got the Soviets very nervous. And again, the context is, as you've already seen, one of heightened tension. And it seems to model their expectation that a real nuclear first strike would take place under the guise of a nuclear war exercise. The other thing that's going on is that in the real world, the non-exercise world, is that ground-launched cruise missiles and Pershing IIs begin being deployed to Germany, the UK, and Belgium in November and December of '83. And the Soviets know that's happening. It's public. The Soviets viewed the Pershing IIs in particular as decapitation weapons, first strike weapons that could travel from West Germany to Moscow in about 6 minutes. So all of this seems, if you're, again, if you've got a preconceived notion, as Operation Rion had, all the puzzle pieces seem to be fitting together here for the Soviets. So what do they do in response? They have an unprecedented reaction. What began to get our attention was their theater forces. And they were doing things we'd never seen them do before, like upload fighter bombers with nuclear weapons at East German and Polish bases. We did this routinely in the US Air Force during the Cold War. They never did it. They also sent mobile missile units out to their pre-surveyed wartime launch locations, which they would not do lightly because they knew we could observe them, and then their secret launch locations were not secret anymore. Their nuclear forces also went to a heightened alert status. Their nuclear bombers went to runway alert. Again, we did that routinely. They did not. ICBMs on their highest alert, their nuclear ballistic missile submarines deployed to launch locations. There were very significant wartime civil defense drills conducted in major Soviet cities throughout the fall period, but that it heightened in November of 1983. And there was a Politburo member named Romanov, who was the spokesman for the Kremlin, essentially. And he was giving public service announcements on nationwide television, telling people nuclear war is imminent, take these drills seriously, know where your nuclear fallout shelter is, et cetera, et cetera. And just to cap things off, Andropov, the leader, is terminally ill. He was in hospital by November and never left it. He died that spring, the following spring, and he had the nuclear football with him at all times. And we know from released records that the Ukrainians gave us that Marshal Ogarkov, who was chief of the general staff of the Soviet Union, was traveling on a daily basis during November out to the hospital where Andropov was to reassure him, we got everything under control. There's no need for, a nuclear escalation here. We've got things under control. So we're observing all of this on the US side, and this gentleman is General Lenny Perutz, who at that time was chief of Air Force intelligence in Europe and NATO. He was alarmed by these Soviet preparations, particularly these theater preparations, which we'd never observed before. He briefs the NATO leadership, and they ask him, well, should we go to a higher alert ourselves? And he argued, no, I think that'll just antagonize them. Let's just let sleeping dogs lie, and let's wind down this Able Archer exercise, and hopefully the Soviets won't get excited about it or more excited about it. So in retrospect, it's unclear how this non-reaction affected Soviet anxiety, but it certainly didn't exacerbate it. In 1989, General Perutz wrote an end of tour report, which became sort of a holy grail for people. It was highly classified, and copies of it were mysteriously lost. And in any event, he wrote this report and as his end of tour report as DIA director, but his report mainly concerned the 1983 crisis when he was not DIA director. He wanted to go on the record with what he believed happened in 1983. This report was classified until the State Department released it in February of 2021. The CIA almost immediately sued in federal court to have it reclassified, and they won that suit and won it in October of 2022. Of course, it was already out on the internet, so the toothpaste was out of the tube, and I have had a chance to read it. And I've also had the chance to talk to General Perutz about it when I was working for him on the air staff. In 1990, the White House, and specifically the PIFIAB, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, commissioned a report to look at 1983 and to determine what really happened. And it was triggered, the PIFIAB action was triggered by someone on the PIFIAB reading the Perutz report. So the PIFIAB put together its own analysis and assessment of 1983, and it was heavily critical of the intelligence community for underestimating the Kremlin's preparation for war and how close we came to a nuclear war in 1983, and applauded Perutz for his fortuitous decision-making at the time. And Perutz, one of the complaints he had in his report is that he was not privy to a lot of human information that CIA had concerning Operation Rion, concerning Soviet preparations for war, et cetera. So the PIFIAB report, which has been declassified, it's out there in redacted fashion, is kind of interesting reading if you want to nerd out on this. Okay, so what are some of the lessons from 1983? I mentioned poor communication. There was massive mistrust between the US and the Soviets, outright hatred, really, and it caused these nuclear powers nearly to stumble into a global nuclear war, in the words of Bob Gates. It also highlights the importance of individuals and courageous leadership to avert a catastrophe. And in all of these instances, fortunately, deterrence held. Another outcome is that the 1983 crisis, much like the 1962 crisis, led to a golden age of arms control. And it had a major impact on both Gorbachev and Reagan. So there were, I think it's fair to say, two golden ages of arms control, one after the 62 crisis and then another after 83. And I'm transitioning now from the history to more what's going on today. And arms control today is, I think it's safe to say, is pretty broken. And we'll just go through a list of some of the key arms control treaties that were promulgated either after the Cuban Missile Crisis or the 83 crisis. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, non-parties to it, 4 of those 5 countries are nuclear powers today. SALT, the first one was the ABM Treaty, abrogated by the US in 2001. The INF Treaty, which was directly prompted by the 1983 crisis. US withdrew in 2019. The Soviets have been violating it for quite some time, of course. Not a nuclear treaty, but a very important one, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe. Russia withdrew in 2015, not long after they invaded and took Crimea. 91, START, replaced by New START in 2010. New START suspended by Russia in 2023, and Putin has given a couple of speeches this year about New START and has essentially said it's dead. I see no reason to restart New START. So, and of course, one important point is that China was never a signatory to any of these, but arms control is broken. So, what are the challenges for deterrence today? They're manyfold, but I'll hit on a few of the highlights I think that are important. On the nuclear side of the equation, the post-Cold War era is over, and Yale historian Paul Bracken terms what we're in now as the second nuclear age. China's nuclear breakout, which I imagine you're all familiar with, most audiences less so, but China is on an unprecedented nuclear buildup at the moment and has changed its nuclear doctrine from one of sufficiency to one of parity or even superiority. it will lead us into a tripolar nuclear world by the early 2030s, a world we've never lived in before. And we don't really have the doctrine, I would argue, or the calculus for how to exist in that world. One of the questions I think the tripolar world raises is the validity of America's extended deterrent. Does the extended deterrent still apply, or is it, I think it does apply, but is it weakened, I guess is a better question, as a result of this tripolar world? Can proliferation be contained? We've got obviously North Korea, which is kind of under the radar in terms of media attention, been on a massive buildup since the talks with Trump broke down. And then, of course, artificial intelligence, bioweapons. There's been recent reporting about bioweapons in Russia that is in the open press, which is kind of alarming. Conventional deterrence, there is a, maybe not a treaty axis, but a certainly loose confederation of autocratic countries that have in common many things, one of which is a rejection of Western norms. And nuclear powers today are fighting conventional proxy wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Deterrence failed in Ukraine and Israel. The big question mark is Taiwan, of course, for the future. So how does the U.S. strengthen deterrence? I mean, there are lots of different things we could get into here, but here are just a few thoughts. I think most people agree, and certainly the bilateral commission that reported out this summer in July agrees that we have a mismatch between geostrategic strategy and our actual defense forces and the budget to support them. I'm a big believer that it's high time, probably past time, for a real rigorous roles and missions review within the Department of Defense, and a realignment of the budget. But first and foremost, the recapitalization of the U.S. nuclear triad needs to go forward, and we really need to fund a space deterrent because we are so heavily dependent on space. Arms control, China, we've tried. I know and the Biden administration did make an attempt beginning last fall to initiate arms control talks with the Chinese. The Chinese in July, I believe it was, just this past summer, said no more arms control talks until they will be linked to Taiwan. Any arms control talks will be linked to U.S. military support to Taiwan. And basically what they're saying is the day you stop military support to Taiwan, we'll be willing to have some arms control talks to you. Will there be a reset with Russia after Ukraine? Certainly Putin doesn't seem very interested at the moment. North Korea, Iran, yeah. The recent developments with NATO in terms of increases to NATO countries' budgets have been promising. Australia was headed in the right direction. Now they've kind of backtracked on their defense budget commitments. Japan is in some turmoil now with the last election. It remains to be seen if they're going to follow through on some commitments that were made. And I think warning capacity, we really did miss the 2014 invasion of Ukraine and the 2023 Hamas attack. So we can't afford to get Taiwan wrong. So I think warning probably deserves some attention. And we started out the presentation today with a quote from General Cotton, and I'll kind of wrap up with this, that in terms of AI and the age of artificial intelligence, you can see from these quotes that he's certainly a strong advocate of ensuring that we've got decision advantage in the nuclear capacity. And those of you who are familiar with our current nuclear command, control, and communications know that it's rather fragmented and consists of a lot of systems that have grown up as stovepipes. So in addition to the nuclear triad being modernized, the NC3 modernization is really crucially important. I think it's another key element of our deterrent posture. So with that, I'll conclude and just mention that if you're interested in learning more about the Able Archer crisis or about the impact of the Soviet war in Afghanistan, these books are available. We've got a few here today if you're interested. And my website has a lot more information. I've got a lot of historical information, especially about the '83 crisis on that website if you're so inclined. So, Jason, I think with that, we're ready to see if there are some questions.
Brian, thank you very much. That was really extraordinary. And I'll just say that storytelling has long been one of the most effective forms of communication and education, and you really do that masterfully. So I want to thank you for being here with us today. I know that I have questions of my own, but I'm going to save them for a private discussion with you. And I'll open the floor to those colleagues and others in the room, as well as those online for the time that we have remaining. Why don't we take a few from the room here first, and then we'll go to folks online. If folks online would like to go ahead and submit their questions via the chat function, that would be very helpful.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yes, really fascinating about how this was, the information was kept secret for so long and the disagreement between the agencies on that. What was curious is, you said that this incident prompted or influenced the arms controls. Can you describe somehow, when was President Reagan notified or when, how well was this at the time communicated to the senior leadership?
Should I repeat the question for the audience online or? Yes? Yeah. Okay. The gentleman just asked a question about the 1983 crisis and how was President Reagan informed and how did it come to influence his view of arms control in his second administration? It's a great question because there was a lot of controversy in the winter of '83 and '84 about how the president should be briefed or what he should be briefed. And I was in Air Force intelligence. I was back in Washington at that time, and we were really butting heads with CIA over this because CIA was downplaying the importance of what had occurred in November of '83, and we had an opposite view, shall we say? And but they ran in those days the presidential daily brief, so they dictated what would be briefed to the president. What did occur was that William Casey was director of Central Intelligence at the time, and a group of analysts in CIA went around their own leadership directly to Casey and argued to him that CIA was under-informing the president. That's my word, not theirs. But and Casey said, okay, we'll put an assessment together for me. And they did. And Casey liked that assessment. He eventually rewrote it himself and then took it to the National Security Council principals in late May or early June of 1984. And he personally briefed Reagan. And his report was at least given, if not personally briefed, to the SecDef and Secretary of State, Vice President, so on. So Reagan got the other side of the story from Casey, and Reagan then wrote about it, not revealing any classified information, but he wrote about it in his diary. And he said this scared the hell out of him. And he in his diary, he said, I had no idea the Soviet leadership was this paranoid and that they would, in a million years, think that we would initiate a nuclear first strike against them. So it really got his attention. And one of the people I've talked to about this is Ken Edelman, who was the director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency for President Reagan. And Ken led the INF treaty negotiations and so on. And Ken said, yeah, it really changed Reagan's thinking. It was beginning to change. I didn't mention this earlier, I think, but in just a week or so after the height of the Able Archer crisis, there was a television movie in the United States called The Day After, which some of you may remember. It still to this day holds the record as the most viewed television movie in history. And it was about the day after a nuclear war between the US and somebody, well, Soviet Union. And Reagan screened it in the White House in October of 1983. And he talked about that in his diary too. And he said, I was depressed for days after watching this film. So his thinking was beginning to change. But that Casey report to him in June of 84 had an impact on him for certain. Yes, sir.
So kind of two questions related to Soviet command and control. You mentioned the dead hand device specifically. Circa 1983, how much did we know about that and how it played into their command and control systems and their efficiency planning? And related to that, you mentioned that they didn't regularly practice putting their nuclear forces on alert or having them on the runways or staging grounds, etc. Was that because of a lack of confidence in their C2 over their nuclear forces, or what was the driving on their side of that?
The question, it's a twofold question. One is about devices like the dead hand and other, proto-AI-ish kinds of tools that the Soviets had in their command and control structure in 83, in that time frame. And then the second question was around nuclear alert status in 83, what was normal for them and what was not, and why were they? The second question I'll tackle first. I think that the Soviets were always concerned about nuclear weapons handling. Now, we were too, but if you think about the Soviet armed forces, even the Soviet Air Force, which was certainly a cut above the Soviet ground forces, they're largely dependent on conscripts. Their NCO corps was weak. They didn't trust these people, is, I think, a fair way of saying it. And so nuclear weapons handling was something they didn't do as routinely as we did. I think in large measure because of those concerns about the personnel. It was a reliability concern. Do they know what they're doing? More so than trust. It was a reliability concern. Are they going to be safe? It's a safety concern. So they were a bit more limited, definitely, in handling nuclear weapons than the United States was at that time. So I think that was a reason that they didn't have nuclear weapons. They certainly didn't do it with what they called their forward aviation in the group of Soviet forces, Germany, or Northern Group of Forces and so forth. And then with their strategic bomber force, they didn't do it. They didn't sit nuclear alert very often. When they did it, it was a big deal and it required a lot of effort. We would observe their nuclear weapons storage and handling mainly through imagery in those days. And they just didn't do it that often. It wasn't nearly as routine for them as it was for us. So I think that's a reason. I think on, dead hand, how much did we know at the time? You're probably better. I know we knew about dead hand in 1983, but it wasn't widely disseminated in the intelligence community. I don't know, Jason, do you have any comment to that?
Yeah.
I think that I won't comment on that here today.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think some of that's still a bit sensitive, but there was certainly some knowledge but it was very tightly controlled in terms of what they were doing. I do know that the unit I was part of in DC for a while, which was a highly specialized unit just focused on the Soviet Union, we had a group of Soviet defectors and emigres who translated books for us from, either books that had been stolen, or books that were openly available in Russia that you could buy in the Soviet Union. Anyway, one of those books was on cybernetics, and I remember reading it and being horrified. And I was so horrified that I got with a CIA analyst and we went up to MIT and we sat with a few professors because it was all unclassified. And we had them read the books. They were horrified. And their response to us was, oh my God, if they could actually do this stuff, they are so far ahead of us in terms of artificial intelligence and thinking about cybernetics. We can only hope that they can't actually engineer this stuff. But theoretically, they're they're advanced beyond where we are. So.
Yeah, we got a couple.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions from the chat room. And one is that's sort of to summarize a couple of people's questions is, how would you characterize the main nuclear threat that the U.S. faces now, and how does the existence of a tripolar world affect both our strategy and the likely the likely role of nuclear weapons in our relationship with Russia and China?
Well, on the first point, you can look at the threat through several different lenses. I guess, in terms of which force is the most capable adversary force, is clearly Russia. Which force is perhaps the least stable and most threatening? That's probably North Korea, which again doesn't receive as much attention as I think it ought to. In terms of where might nuclear weapons be used, I know many people fear a nuclear confrontation between India and Pakistan as a likely place for it to occur. We obviously saw Russia saber rattling 2 years ago over Ukraine. So I think threat needs to be looked at, again, through several different lenses. One is capability is definitely Russia. They're number one. Perhaps instability and concern of threat, North Korea would be number one. And then the potential for a nuclear confrontation in South Asia is of great concern. And then the second question was on the tripolar world. And I people are beginning to write about this. I think that, talking to, as I have, to some of our real experts on nuclear doctrine, we don't really even have a lexicon for a tripolar world yet. What I hear most from people is that first order, we've got to recapitalize the nuclear triad. We've just got to do that so that at least we're running in place with Russia and eventually with China. I think it's how we handle a tripolar world. There's ample opportunity for new research and for doctrine development because I don't think we really have it at this point. So.
Okay, maybe we can take one more quick one. Dan?
Sure, Brian, thanks. That was a great presentation. So in the background of Able Archer, the Soviet-Afghan war is raging on, and eventually we won that war working through the Mujahideen and did it while deterrence held. So fast forward where President Putin's threatening nuclear war over Ukraine. And that got a lot of people in Washington thinking about escalation and deterrence. How does your experience, how does your thinking about writing the book inform how far we can push escalation in Ukraine?
Yeah, that's, well, obviously we've been calibrating very carefully, raising the stakes in Ukraine to the point where many argue that we should have recalibrated faster, right? Particularly in 2022 and 2023. I think I'll just quote what the director of CIA and others have said. I think that the probability of a Russian usage of nuclear weapons in Ukraine is low, but it isn't zero. And what are the preconditions that might lead them to use nuclear weapons? I think a viable Ukrainian threat against Crimea would be a red line for the Russians. Would it trigger a nuclear response? I think the Russians would look at all their options. If they really felt that Crimea was under threat, that they were in danger of losing Crimea, I think they'd have to look at a range of options. Would that lead them to a nuclear escalatory posture? It's impossible to say for certain, but I think it would be one of the options they'd certainly examine. There's an article that just came out in Foreign Affairs this week that is really, I found very alarming. And that was the potential for an accidental nuclear event because of where the Russians have nuclear weapons stored and transshipment points for nuclear weapons in Western Russia. Engels Air Force Base was pointed out as the Ukrainians have attacked Engels with cruise missiles and other weapons systems. And Engels has a co-located nuclear weapons storage facility. And while hitting that wouldn't cause a nuclear detonation, if there were weapons being, traded out for maintenance purposes and that sort of thing, if they were out in the open, it would cause a fissile event, right? And so it's worried. It's not just use of nuclear weapons. There's also a vulnerability in terms of these nuclear weapons being in locations that are really in the war zone. That should be perhaps given a little bit more attention to.
Okay. And with that, and us being right at 11 o'clock, we'll conclude here.